Clint Eastwood walks into the courtroom, calm but commanding. The judge smirks, dismissing him as just another Hollywood actor out of his depth. With an air of arrogance, the judge mocks Clint, expecting him to fumble. But what happens next silences the entire courtroom. This isn't just a legal showdown, it's a battle of wit, experience, and undeniable brilliance. As Clint unleashes his unexpected legal prowess, the judge's confidence starts to crack. What shocking revelation does he deliver? How does he turn the tables in the most dramatic way possible? Stay tuned until the end to witness the genius moment that no one saw coming. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get started. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats. The air smelled of polished wood and freshly printed legal documents, a sterile yet heavy scent that carried the weight of judgment. Overhead, fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over the mahogany benches and the towering judge's bench. Clint Eastwood sat calmly at the defendant's table, his weathered hands resting on the polished wood. His face was a mask of quiet confidence, but inside, a storm brewed. He wasn't here to put on a show, this was real, and he knew the judge saw him as nothing more than a washed-up actor with no place in a courtroom. Clint had seen the smirk, the flicker of condescension in the judge's eyes when he walked in. He could almost hear the unspoken words. What's a movie star doing trying to play lawyer? He glanced down at the documents in front of him, the crisp edges of the paper pressing against his fingertips. The weight of the moment settled in his chest. Not fear, not doubt, but something deeper. A need to prove that intelligence and experience couldn't be dismissed with a smirk. That he wasn't just a man of scripted lines and rehearsed stunts. He had studied the law, he had lived by principles stronger than any courtroom pretense. The gavel struck once, a sharp, commanding crack that echoed through the chamber. Clint lifted his gaze to the judge, his steel blue eyes unwavering. He had been underestimated before. It was almost amusing at this point. They always thought they had him figured out, until they didn't. The judge leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Mr. Eastwood," he drawled, his voice thick with amusement. "I hope you're prepared for what happens when reality doesn't follow a script." Clint let the words hang in the air, unbothered by the laughter that rippled through the courtroom. He simply adjusted his jacket, feeling the rough fabric of his blazer against his skin, and allowed a small smirk to tug at the corner of his lips. They have no idea what's coming. The judge leaned back in his high-backed chair, flipping through the case file with a smirk. His gavel rested loosely in his grip, a tool of authority he clearly enjoyed wielding. He exhaled sharply through his nose, as if trying to suppress his amusement. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, his voice thick with skepticism, "I must say this is highly unusual. An actor representing himself in my courtroom." He shook his head as he scanned the papers in front of him. "Are we supposed to expect a monologue? Maybe some dramatic pause before you object?" Laughter rippled through the gallery. A few attorneys at the prosecution table exchanged amused glances, their suits pristine, their expressions smug. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-jawed man named Richard Calloway, leaned over his desk, speaking just loud enough for Clint to hear. "This isn't a movie, cowboy." His tone dripped with condescension. "Real law isn't something you learn between film takes." Clint remained seated, his expression unshaken. But inside, a fire burned. He had been underestimated before, many times, but here, in a room where people were supposed to value logic over perception, he felt something deeper. Disrespect. This wasn't just about him, it was about the principle, about people who thought status, pedigree, and degrees were the only things that mattered. He had spent years studying law, not for show, not for ego, but because he believed in justice. And now, here he was, dismissed before he even spoke a word. The judge sighed. "You do realize, Mr. Eastwood, that if this case is beyond your understanding, I won't hesitate to throw it out. That could mean serious legal consequences for you." Clint finally stood. The room seemed to shift as he did, his presence commanding in a way no script could replicate. He adjusted his tie, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. His boots barely made a sound against the polished floor, but the weight of his presence was deafening. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice even, controlled. "I may not have spent my life in a courtroom like you. I may not have a fancy office filled with law books I've never read. But I know this case. I know the law. And I know when people use power to mock instead of serve." The judge's smirk faltered, just slightly. Clint turned his gaze to the prosecution table. "And I know when a man underestimates his opponent." A tense silence filled the room. The laughter had stopped. Calloway scoffed, sitting back in his chair. "We'll see about that." The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Fine," he said, though his voice carried less amusement now. "Proceed, Mr. Eastwood. Let's see if you can back up your words." Clint nodded once, stepping toward the podium. The fight had begun, and he was ready. Clint Eastwood squared his shoulders as he approached the podium. The judge's smirk had faded, but doubt still lingered in his eyes. Across the room, the prosecution team exchanged looks, some amused, some skeptical. The weight of expectation pressed against Clint's back, but he didn't flinch. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not in the comfort of a law school, surrounded by like-minded students, but in the real world, where justice wasn't always black and white, and where power often decided truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clint began, his voice steady, "this case isn't about me. It's about a system that too often mistakes arrogance for wisdom and underestimates those who don't fit its mold." Calloway scoffed. "Objection, grandstanding." The judge sighed, but nodded. "Sustained. Stick to the facts, Mr. Eastwood." Clint dipped his head slightly in acknowledgement, but his eyes never left Calloway's. "The facts are simple. My client was wrongfully accused. The evidence against him is circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, and yet the prosecution has built its entire case on the assumption that perception is reality." He let the words settle before continuing. "But perception isn't reality. And today we're going to prove that." A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Calloway stood, straightening his tie. "Well, if we're talking about perception, let's address the elephant in the room. Mr. Eastwood, you're an actor, not an attorney." He turned to the jury, spreading his hands. "Sure, you might recognize him from the big screen, but legal expertise isn't something you pick up between takes." Laughter bubbled through the courtroom again. Clint remained still. Calloway pressed on. "Tell me, Mr. Eastwood, how many years have you actually practiced law?" Clint met his gaze. "I've spent a lifetime studying human nature, understanding power, and most importantly, recognizing when the system is being manipulated." Calloway smirked. "That's not an answer." Clint leaned slightly forward. Neither is yours. A murmur swept through the jury box. Calloway's jaw clenched. The judge cleared his throat. Let's move on. But Calloway wasn't finished. He turned to the jury, pacing slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, this trial is about credibility, and credibility comes from experience, education, and expertise. He turned back to Clint, his smile sharp. Tell me, Mr. Eastwood, did you pass the bar exam? A silence stretched across the courtroom. Clint let the moment linger before answering. No. Calloway raised his brows, his expression triumphant. No further questions? Clint exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. The jury was watching him closely now, some uncertain, some intrigued. He had known this moment would come. The doubt, the dismissal, the assumption that his presence in this courtroom was nothing more than a spectacle. But he also knew something else. Truth had a way of cutting through arrogance. He turned to face the jury. Did I pass the bar? He nodded. No, I didn't. But let me tell you what I did do. He took a step closer. I spent years studying law, not for a degree, not for a title, but because I believe in justice. I've read every case, analyzed every loophole, understood every angle. Not in a classroom. In the real world, he let his words hang for a moment. And that means I understand something that textbooks can't teach. The power of bias. Calloway scoffed. Bias? Clint turned to him. Yes, the bias that says a man in a suit with a degree is automatically more capable than a man who's spent his life understanding people. The bias that assumes perception is more important than truth. He gestured toward the prosecution. They want you to focus on me, my career, my past. But this case isn't about me. His voice lowered. It's about justice. A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge shifted in his seat. Let's proceed. Clint nodded, turning back to his notes. The fight was far from over, but the tide was shifting. Clint Eastwood stood tall, his piercing gaze locked onto the jury. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The prosecution had spent the last hour discrediting him, belittling his presence, mocking his lack of a law degree. But they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated him. Calloway smirked, flipping through his notes. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Mr. Eastwood, do you have anything to say before we proceed to closing arguments? Clint exhaled slowly, then stepped forward. Actually, Your Honor, I do. The courtroom stilled. He turned to the jury, his voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, I have sat quietly as the prosecution has done their best to paint me as a fraud, an actor pretending to be a lawyer. And you know what? They're right. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Calloway leaned back in his chair, smug. Clint continued, his voice unwavering. I am not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school. I didn't spend years in a university classroom. But let me tell you what I have done. He let his gaze settle on each juror. I have spent my life learning about justice, not from textbooks, but from experience, from the streets, from the stories of real people who were crushed under the weight of a system designed to keep them silent. Calloway sat up straighter. Something in Clint's tone had changed. Clint reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. What if I told you that everything the prosecution has built their case on is a lie? He unfolded the paper and held it up. Because this, he let the words sink in, is the real evidence they didn't want you to see. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. Explain yourself, Mr. Eastwood. Clint turned toward Calloway. The prosecution's key witness, the one whose testimony they used to build their case, was paid off. Calloway shot to his feet. Objection. Speculation. Clint's voice cut through the noise. I have proof. He handed the document to the bailiff, who walked it to the judge. The room fell into silence as the judge's eyes scanned the page. His expression hardened. Calloway's confidence faltered. This is bank statements, Clint finished for him. A direct transfer from your office to the prosecution's witness. A bribe. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The jury exchanged stunned glances. Calloway's face drained of color. This is outrageous. Clint took a step closer, his voice like steel. No, what's outrageous is that you tried to manipulate this courtroom. You thought you could hide the truth behind procedure, behind technicalities. He turned back to the jury. But justice isn't about who has the most degrees. It's about who's willing to fight for the truth. The judge's gavel slammed down. Mr. Calloway, I suggest you explain yourself immediately. Calloway stammered, but the damage was done. Clint stood firm, his heart pounding. He had spent his life fighting for justice in the movies. Today, he did it for real. The courtroom was in chaos. Reporters whispered furiously, scribbling notes. Cameras flashed, and the jury sat frozen, absorbing what had just happened. The judge rapped his gavel 3 times. Order in the court. His voice cut through the commotion, but the weight of Clint's revelation still hung thick in the air. Calloway stood stiff, his once confident smirk wiped clean. He clenched his fists, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Clint remained still, his expression unreadable. He had seen this moment play out before, in scripts, in film reels, but this was different. This was real. A man's fate had nearly been decided by a corrupt system, and if he hadn't stepped in, justice would have been trampled under legal loopholes and deceit. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple before turning to the prosecutor. Mr. Calloway, you will explain this immediately. Calloway swallowed hard, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, this is clearly a misunderstanding. Clint let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. A misunderstanding? You bribed a witness to win a case, and you got caught. The only misunderstanding here is that you thought you'd get away with it. Murmurs spread across the gallery. The judge studied the bank statements again, his frown deepening. I will be calling for an immediate review of the prosecution's conduct. He turned to the jury. In light of this new evidence, I am declaring a mistrial. Relief washed over Clint, but he didn't show it. The defendant, Mr. Reynolds, a man who had been fighting an uphill battle for months, clasped his hands together, his face crumpling in disbelief. He had spent nights fearing he would be locked away for something he hadn't done. Now, hope flickered in his weary eyes. Reynolds turned to Clint, his voice hoarse. I don't know how to thank you. Clint's lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. You don't have to. The judge banged his gavel again. Court is adjourned. As people began filing out, Calloway stormed up to Clint, his face red with rage. You think you're some kind of hero? He hissed. You humiliated me. Clint turned to him, his expression calm but firm. You humiliated yourself. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Calloway could hear. Next time, try winning a case with integrity instead of corruption. Calloway's jaw tensed, but he had no response. With a final glare, he stormed off. Clint exhaled slowly, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of what had just happened. He had walked into this courtroom expecting resistance, expecting mockery, and he got it. But he also got something else. He got to remind them all, justice wasn't about titles, degrees, or courtroom theatrics. It was about truth. As he stepped outside, the warm sun hit his face. Reporters rushed up, microphones in hand, but he ignored them. Instead, he looked over at Reynolds, who stood beside his wife and children, holding them close, their faces shining with gratitude. That was enough. That was why he had done this. And as Clint walked away, he felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. Outside the courthouse, Clint Eastwood stood still for a moment, taking in the crisp air. The weight of the trial, the confrontation, and the revelation still lingered. But something inside him felt lighter. He had always believed in justice, but today he had fought for it in a way that went beyond scripts and film sets. This wasn't about a role, it was real, and it mattered. Reynolds approached, his wife clutching his arm, their children standing close. His voice trembled with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Clint met his eyes and shook his head. "Don't. Just live your life. That's payment enough." For a moment, there was silence. Then a deep understanding passed between them. A man, nearly destroyed by a corrupt system, was now free to rebuild his life. And Clint had played a role in making that happen. As reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, Clint ignored the noise. His old self might have had a sharp remark ready, something quick-witted to throw back at the judge or the prosecutor. But now he simply nodded, tipping his hat slightly before walking away. The world would keep spinning. Another case, another scandal, another headline. But in this moment, Clint had done something that wasn't for show, wasn't for applause. It was for what was right. And that was enough. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Clint Eastwood's courtroom showdown wasn't just a battle of words. It was a lesson in integrity, wisdom, and resilience. What would you have done in his place? Have you ever witnessed someone underestimated only for them to prove everyone wrong? Let us know in the comments. What's your take on this incredible moment? And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of justice, redemption, and unexpected twists.